This is the Catholic Family Podcast, and I'm happy to be once again joined by Mr. Louie of AKACatholic.com. Hopefully, you've all been here with us during this series. We've covered now, I think, 7, 8, 9 different episodes on Vatican II. We've done a deep dive into the documents of the Second Vatican Council. I say we, but really Louie's the one who did it. He's done all the work. I'm just kind of here to give a little bit of supporting ideas and to he can bounce things off me, whatnot. But really, and I've said it many times, thanks so much to Louie for doing the work on this, because it's valuable stuff. And again, it is actually looking at the words themselves of these documents. And I just think that's the way to approach this, rather than just like, oh, Vatican II is from the devil. It's like, okay, why do we say that? Well, what is actually wrong with Vatican II? And thus far, well, if you've watched this series, I think you've seen pretty clearly, it's modernist, it's ecumenical, it falsely, etc. There's a lot of stuff that we have covered that is pretty shocking. There have been several of these episodes where I've left really with my mouth hanging open, like, they said what? And, well, I have no doubt we're going to find that again today in part 2 of the document Dignitatis Humanae. So we covered part 1 a couple weeks ago, and now you will get part 2 of that document. So that being said, Louie, again, thank you so much for being here. And, take it away.
Totally my pleasure, Kevin. Thank you for having me again. And I think I want to begin with just a very brief recap of some highlights from part 1. So we found that in the Declaration on Religious Freedom, the Council states this, quote, "This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom." As for where this right comes from, the Council says, quote, "The right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person." And we noted that the Council speaking as if human dignity is the source of man's liberty, which it is not. And if, that point's lost on you, go back to the first episode on Dignitatis Humanae, and we explained that at length. We also talked about how this amounts to really a stunning assertion of an error that was plainly condemned in numerous places, but one of them being the Syllabus of Errors of Pope Pius IX. And he condemned the false notion that man has a right to practice whatever religion he may choose or none at all. And this is essentially the doctrine that Vatican Council II is putting forth here plainly. These two things are irreconcilable. The Declaration also states, as we discussed in the last episode, quote, "No one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits." And we took note of the fact that these due limits are not defined by the Council. And so it's left up to the government to decide when and how religion is to be limited. Elsewhere, the Council says something similar. It says, quote, "The right to religious freedom is not to be impeded, provided that just public order is observed." And once again, the Declaration does not define what just public order is. And so it essentially leaves it up to the state, to the government, to decide what is just and what is not. And we can see the results, in our own day, here in the United States, for sure. The Council does, however, make demands of the state. It states this, quote, "This right to religious freedom, this right of the human person to religious freedom, is to be recognized in the constitutional law whereby society is governed, and thus it is to become a civil right." Notice the very direct language here. It is to be recognized. It is to become a civil right. And it occurred to me when I was preparing notes for this episode, just how contradictory, almost, dual personalities this declaration has. Because on the one hand, it insists that the state treat all religions as equals, making no distinction at all between what is true and what is false. And it also leaves up to the state to define what due limits are and what just public order is. And yet, on the other hand, the Council has the audacity to dictate to the state the terms of its own constitution.
It is interesting. And just real quickly, it's interesting that this was also during the civil rights movement in America, right? This was right at the exact same time. Is that right? So this would have been in '65, and the civil rights was also in '65, right? I think that's when it really started to kick up. That's interesting. It just kind of struck me just now that was probably kind of connected. And this was the one that was largely influenced by that American priest, right? Murray. Is that right?
Yeah, John Courtney Murray. American Jesuit. Yeah. So now don't misunderstand. The Holy Catholic Church has every right to make demands on the state, right? And to assert her exclusive prerogatives. And why is that? Well, because she's moved to proclaim that she is the custodian of the one true religion that was established by Christ, who is king. He to whom all authority has been given. It's hers to protect and to propagate. And it's her job to inform the state on how it should legislate in a manner that upholds its duty toward God and to Christ the King. Well, the Conciliar Church makes no such claim for itself, or for Christ the King for that matter. So it just seems to me it's a little disjointed. On the one hand, it makes no claims. On the other, it makes quite an audacious claim, telling the state how to write its own constitution. In any case, we're going to continue now in part 2 by picking up the conversation in Article 3 of the Declaration, and it reads as follows. There is a further consideration. The religious acts whereby men, in private and in public, and out of a sense of personal conviction, direct their lives to God, is such that governments ought to indeed take account of the religious life of the citizenry and show it favor. End quote. Now, what stands out here is that this is very much in keeping with some of the things that we pointed out in the last episode, and that's the council makes no distinction at all. It doesn't ask the state to make any distinctions between those personal religious convictions that are false and those that are founded in truth. Rather, it implies that all religious acts serve to, quote, direct lives to God. Now, the reason alone tells us that this is gravely erroneous, right? I mean, as Catholics, we know very well that the Hindu, the Buddhist, the Muslim, the Jew, the pagan, none of them are directing their life to God by holding fast to their false convictions, right? Now, are some of these people sincerely seeking God? Sure, we can presume that they are. And it's for this very reason, for the good of their souls, that the Catholic Church would never teach, as an act of the Supreme Magisterium, which Vatican II claims to be, that these persons are, in fact, directing their lives to God through these false religious convictions. Nor would the Church encourage the state to treat all religions equally, as this declaration does. One of the things we find, on this note, even though it really is Catholic common sense, in the encyclical Immortale Dei, Pope Leo XIII states this: to hold that there is no difference in manners of religion between forms that are unlike each other and even contrary to each other most clearly leads in the end to the rejection of all religion in both theory and practice. End quote. And this is a prophetic statement in a way, because this is exactly what's going on in places like the United States, where religious liberty is a core principle of the Constitution here and has been from its very founding, that there's a wholesale rejection of religion in practice, and we see it throughout society.
So Louis, what would the church have taught then in a Catholic country, I suppose, regarding the state? So let's say, you have at least some unity of church and state, but the church isn't running the state. So what would they have said? So you would have said, obviously, it needs to be a Catholic country. The Catholicism is the religion of that country. And then I guess they would use the word tolerate, I suppose. Is that right? They would say, you should tolerate the other religions. You shouldn't persecute them, etc. But of course, the state religion should be Catholicism. Is that right?
Yeah, and we're going to get to that in some great detail a little further on in this episode, but we touched on that a little bit in the last episode, the idea that, rulers of state, they're obligated to give public honor to Christ the King. And of course, that means giving special favor to the Catholic religion. At the same time, though, the state does not say that, the church does not say that the state sins by tolerating the false religions, that sometimes that's actually the course that it should take for the common good. And I think the example that we used is, when Billy Graham would come to town and hold a big rally in a public venue, it probably would make more sense for the ruling parties there to allow this to happen, rather than to shut it down and arrest the people that arranged it and so on and so forth. So it's a matter of prudence on the part of those who hold civil authority when it makes sense or it benefits the common good. It maybe avoids a greater evil to tolerate the public practice of a false religion, and when it's actually better to shut it down or to restrict it and restrain it. But one of the Holy Fathers that I quoted last week, and I think it might have been Leo XIII, he's very he's moved to point out that the more the civil authority tolerates these errors, the further it's leading itself away from what it should be. So there's a balance to be struck there. And as far as what it means to be a Catholic state, we're going to get to that in some detail and see how it changed after the council. And it's pretty stunning what the results were. Now, all of this is common sense about the idea that, any religious practice puts one on a path that leads to God. This, obviously, we know that's false, but just to be very clear, to make sure everybody understands it's not me talking. In the encyclical Mortalium Animos, which we've touched on a number of times here, Pope Pius XI plainly condemned, quote, that false opinion which considers all religions to be more or less good and praiseworthy, and by which we are led to God. And this is almost verbatim exactly the opinion that's being put forth by the council here.
That's fascinating.
When it proposes that men's religious. Yeah, it's almost like they read Mortalium Animos and say, hey, let's live some of the verbiage out of this to put into our faithless document. They're specifically saying that these religious acts that are, many of them false, they direct one's life to God. It's remarkable. Now, viewers might recall one of Bergoglio's most controversial statements, and we talked about it, I think, a little bit last week, that one where he was in, I think it was in Singapore, an interreligious meeting with young people. And he said, and I'm quoting here, all religions are a path to arrive at God. And you may recall there was a major uproar here. But it seems to me that what nearly every so-called traditional Catholic commentator failed to acknowledge is that Francis was merely making explicit what the Second Vatican Council implicitly taught in this document, when it says that essentially that all religious acts direct men's lives toward God. It's the same thing. Bergoglio, again, and his predecessors too, not a free agent, not making anything up, but simply carrying forth the revolution that started at Vatican II. And this point keeps coming up, Kevin, and I think it's a really important one, that the erroneous teachings and the faithless acts that permeate the conciliar church, they're rooted not in this papal claimant or that papal claimant or any individual bishop or any conference of bishops or any theologian or theological school. No, this apostasy is firmly rooted in Vatican II. And if the viewers of this series get nothing else out of this series, let it be this. That the madness that we're living through now has an origin, and it's the council. And I'm going to give two more examples, if I may. Another one of Bergoglio's most controversial errors concerns the statement that he made in this so-called Abu Dhabi agreement. It's a declaration on human fraternity, where he said, quote, the pluralism and diversity of religions, color, sex, race, and language are willed by God. And this statement sparked a major uproar as well. And viewers may recall that Bishop Athanasius Schneider kind of led the charge, and he even confronted Francis in person about this. Now, that confrontation was to no avail, of course. The document was recorded without correction in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, the official acts of the conciliar church, which means that it's being preserved and propagated as papal magisterium, which is yet another very clear sign that neither the council nor the conciliar church that it birthed or the men who have been leading it for these 60 plus years, none of them are actually Catholic. In any case, what got lost here again is the point that we're making. Even this grave error that God views all religions, even the false ones, that he wills them directly, it has its roots in Vatican II, right here in the Declaration of Religious Freedom. How so? Well, think about it. As we discussed in the last episode, all authentic human rights come from God, right? And as such, these rights must accord with his will, which is why we can say that to sin, even if only by mistake, it's neither a right nor an exercise of true freedom. Rather, it's an abuse of freedom for which we have no right. Okay, that's the church's understanding. The rights that God bestows on us, then, are always ordered toward the good and the true, leading us to the end for which we were created, namely eternal life with him. And that we should come to live with him in all eternity is his divine will, so much so that he took flesh and died on the cross for us. Now, if it's true, though, that he grants to mankind a right to freely practice just any religion, which is precisely what the Declaration of Religious Freedom is proposing, it only follows that he wills these religions. In other words, that all of these false religions somehow accord with his will. So again, we can see where, in this case, if one just takes the time to connect some dots, you quickly discover that Jorge Bergoglio was not making anything up here. He's simply propagating the false religion that was born in Vatican
as
II.
we record this in December of 2025, you have the current scandal with Prevost, also known as Leo the 14th, trying to hold hands with the Orthodox, right? I mean, trying to really unify with them, not in terms of bringing them to Catholicism, but just saying, yeah, we're the same. It's fine. It's fine. It's not a problem. And again, it's exactly right, Louie. It's all connected, and it all roots back to exactly what we've been talking about. And I think that's the primary purpose, I hope, of this entire series, is to show that, again, exactly as you said, this is not just something new. It's not just the last two popes. We're not Bene Vacantists who think, oh yeah, after Benedict is where it started. Nope. It all goes back to Vatican II.
No question. I'm going to give one example, last one, and I think this one might surprise some of the viewers. Amors Laetitia, right, which is, in my view, the most blasphemous text ever to come out of Conciliar Rome, because it literally teaches, among other grave errors, that those who persist in relationships that are characterized by fornication or adultery, they can at times, quote, come to see with a certain moral security that it is what God himself is asking amid the concrete complexity of one's limits, end quote. Now, obviously, it's outrageous in the extreme to suggest that God wills adultery. But we might ask, from where does such a vile thought come? Well, obviously, spoiler alert, it's coming from the council. And in fact, it's coming from this document. So when the council insists that man has a God-given right to practice whatever religion he may choose, which, as we just discussed, strongly implies that God wills the diversity of religions, including those that worship false gods, what's actually happening here is it's a claim that God wills that man should at times break the first commandment, right? That's what a false religion does. Even if the person is sincere in seeking him, they're breaking the first commandment. Now, for those who accept that this is true, people who believe that the council teaches truth, well, it only stands to reason that God may at times will adultery as well, a violation of the sixth commandment. If in fact God can will that man breaks the first commandment, why not the sixth? Why not any of them for that matter? And so with this in mind, I would argue that the theological seeds for the blasphemy that's found in Amors Laetitia can be found right here in the Declaration on Religious Freedom of Vatican II. And I think that's an important point with regard to this document itself, because it's not just, it's not limited just to the topic at hand. It has far-reaching effects on the doctrine that the church teaches more generally. And that seems pretty obvious. Now, not surprisingly, Dignitatis Humanae had a more direct impact still on the matter of church-state relations, the topic that you just brought up, Kevin. And needless to say, the conciliar counterfeit church's ideal is nothing like that of the Holy Catholic Church. And a great place to look for an authoritative treatment of the Catholic understanding is the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, Immortale Dei, on the Constitution of Christian States. In this document, the Holy Father begins by addressing this topic with the most basic truth that all authority comes from God, right? In other words, he makes the point that those who rule and govern are beholden to God and his law. Their power doesn't come from the people at the ballot box, like so many people in the United States where I live seem to think. It comes just as Jesus told Pilate, from above. The Holy Father says this, quote, "No society can hold together unless someone be over all. Every body politic must have a ruling authority, and this authority has God for its author. Everything, without exception, must be subject to him and must serve him," end quote. Now, again, this is a lot of Catholic common sense, but it brings about the question, how are those who govern to know what it means to exercise their power, subject to and in service to God, in truth, according to his holy will? Well, the answer for our viewers is pretty obvious, right? it's the Catholic Church, but let's listen to what Pope Leo had to say. This is Leo the 13th, by the way, not the 14th. So for the sake of time here, I'm going to provide quotes paraphrased in bullet point fashion rather than reading entire paragraphs, but I would invite viewers to look up this document, Immortale Dei, and read it in full because it's very illuminating. So the Holy Father states this: the state is clearly bound to act up to the manifold and weighty duties linking it to God by the public profession of religion. No one is allowed to be remiss in the service due to God. The chief duty of all men is to cling to religion in both its reaching and practice, not such religion as they may have a preference for, but the religion which God enjoins, the only one true religion. It's a sin for the state not to have care for religion as something beyond its scope. We, and this includes the state, are bound absolutely to worship God in that way in which he has shown to be his holy will. The bounden duty of rulers to the people over whom they rule is to hold and honor the holy name of God and to favor religion. Let me step out for a minute and just remind viewers that when Pope Leo XIII speaks here of the state's duty to favor religion, he does so only after making it perfectly clear that he's not talking about just any religion, but rather the one true religion. And it's this religion that he says the rulers of people are duty bound to, quote, to protect it, to shield it under the credit and sanction of the law of laws, and neither to organize nor to enact any measure that may compromise its safety. End quote. Now, another question may come up. What about those rulers who are not Catholic and who look out at the landscape and they see what Bergoglio called the diversity of religions? And perhaps these rulers are wondering which of them accords with God's will. Well, the Holy Father makes it known that such persons can easily discover which of these religions is the true religion, if only they seek it sincerely, as they are duty bound to do. He states this, quote, "Now it cannot be difficult to find out which is the true religion, if only it be sought with an earnest and unbiased mind, for proofs are abundant and striking. It is evident that the only true religion is the one established by Jesus Christ himself, and which he committed to his church to protect and to propagate." End quote. Now, to be perfectly clear, the duty enjoined on rulers toward the true religion is not limited only to those rulers who are Catholic, right? In his encyclical on the kingship of Christ, Pius XI quoted Pope Leo XIII, this time writing in the encyclical called Annum Sancrum, wherein Pope Leo XIII stated this, quote, "The empire of Christ includes not only Catholic nations, not only baptized persons, though of right belonging to the church, and have been led astray and cut off by schism and so forth, so that truly the whole of mankind is subject to the power of Christ. Catholic nations are not the only ones that are beholding to Christ the King and to his holy religion." Pius XI was also very clear in stating, as the church has always professed, quote, "The Catholic Church is the kingdom of Christ on earth, destined to be spread among all men and all nations." Now, a lot of quotes here, but all of this is to say that the church, in carrying out her mission of teaching and baptizing the nations, naturally she labors toward establishing in this world nations that are ordered in such a way as to reflect everything whatsoever that our Lord taught. That's the divine commission. So that's to say that nations, the rulers of which uphold their duty toward the one true religion as taught by Pope Leo XIII, for example, in Immortale Dei, they are to govern in such way that the ordering of their nation reflects the Catholic faith. Now, we might say that a nation that recognizes, protects, and supports the Catholic faith, granting exclusive rights to the church and her doctrines, the rulers of which are publicly honoring Christ and governing accordingly, that this is the ideal expression of the relationship between church and state. I think it's more appropriate, however, to say that such a relationship between the church and the state is actually the will of Almighty God. And, our time together sneaks up on me every week, Kevin, as I'm preparing for this. So I have a feeling if I do enough research, I'm going to find that kind of verbiage somewhere in the magisterium. It's just not an ideal. It's actually the will of God. And that much is clear just from the great commission that he gave to the apostles. Does the conciliar church, by contrast, the one that was birthed at Vatican II, can we say that it labors to see God's will in the matter of church-state relations come to fruition, encouraging the states, the various nations of the world to come into the life of the Catholic Church so that they may reflect in their ordering everything that Jesus taught? Well, the answer is no, obviously. But for an answer here, I want to turn to a guy named Archbishop Roland Minerath, Archbishop of Dijon, France, now retired. And his name might be familiar to some viewers because he made traditional Catholic headlines back in 2021 when he expelled the Fraternity of St. Peter from the Archdiocese due to their exclusive attachment to the traditional Latin Mass. And up until that point, the FSSP had been ministering in the sacraments and offering the traditional Latin Mass at two different chapels for more than 20 years at that point. They had quite a large community. And this expulsion came actually before Traditionis Custodes, before it was published. But there was an outcry and protest among the people that were devoted to those particular parishes and chapels. And Minerath told the protesters, just you wait, a new motu proprio is coming, and it's going to explain my decision. So he was so excited about Traditionis Custodes cracking down on the Latin Mass that he couldn't wait for it to get published. So he expels the FSSP from the diocese. So clearly this man, Minerath, he's a man of the council to the bone, like all of these people that we've been discussing in the Conciliar Church. And in 1998, he wrote an article about how church-state relations changed after Vatican II. And it offers a concise snapshot of the impact that Dignitatis Humanae had. And I think it might be useful for us to consider what he wrote here. He writes this, quote, significant steps have been undertaken by the Holy See with countries which named Catholicism as the state religion in both their constitutions and concordats, such as Spain, Italy, Colombia, Argentina, Monaco, Peru, and Malta. The mention of state religion disappeared from all new concordats signed after 1964. It was the wish of the Holy See to avoid these statements, which look like privileges and were incompatible with the doctrine of the neutrality of the state. End quote. Now, keep in mind, he's writing approvingly of this development.
Shocking.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, well, this is a good thing.
Just logically, I mean, again, as you said, I mean, if our faith is true, then shouldn't it have all rights to everything, right? I mean, if it's God's religion, then of course it should be taught by all people in all countries and all. You know, I mean, again, logically, they just make sense. So it's always kind of baffled me, that whole idea of everyone should have, the equal rights to do whatever they want. It's like, well, they can't all be true. So, I mean, how does that make even any sense? I mean, why should we be neutral? Now, again, that doesn't mean we persecute, but just neutrally acting like everyone's the same. It's silly. It's against sense.
Yeah, it's illogical, right? I mean, if you really believe that this is the religion of God, well, obviously you want it to permeate every part of society, including the government. So this is one of the things, Kevin, that stands out to me about the so-called radical Muslims. They're wrong, obviously. It's a false religion with a false God, right? But at least they have, that logical component to their faith. They really believe this is God's will. Well, darn it, it's going to be Sharia law because God's law should permeate everything. They at least got that concept right. And the church used to have that idea, where the Catholic Church still does. Clearly, the Conciliar Church does not. And just to give viewers an idea of what was lost here, let's take a look at one of the countries that this Minerath person named, glowingly about how things have changed. In Spain, a 1946 document in English called the Charter of the Spaniards, which is kind of like a Bill of Rights, it was stated this, quote, the profession and practice of the Catholic religion, which is that of the Spanish state, will enjoy official protection. No one will be harassed for his religious beliefs or in the private exercise of his worship. No other ceremonies or external manifestations other than those of the state religion will be permitted. End quote. So this meant that as a Catholic confessional state, Spanish legislation on such things as education, family law, public morality, and such, they were expressly informed by Catholic doctrine. And notice here that what I just read from this sort of Bill of Rights, that it states with regard to religious beliefs and worship activities other than those that are Catholic, that persons will not be harassed for these things, but provided that those things are exercised privately, right? There's no opening here for them to take them out into the public square. Now, to American ears, this may sound very harsh, but consider what happened here in the United States when Roe v. Wade was overturned and questions regarding the legality of abortion were sent back to the states, okay? In the immediate aftermath of that, so-called Jewish rabbis publicly declared that access to abortion is a matter of their religious liberty. And they said that their ability to mutilate their unborn children by way of abortion is, quote, a Jewish value. And they even distorted certain Old Testament passages in order to make the case, as if abortion is somehow acceptable to Almighty God, right? Now, people obviously took note of that. I wrote about it. Other people talked about it. It's like the mask is off. Abortion is a sacrament to these people. They came right out and were stating it. But imagine this filth being publicly broadcast in a nation like Spain in the 1940s and the decades immediately following, where the population was overwhelmingly Catholic and where its civil authorities legislated in a manner consistent with Catholic doctrine. The effect that would have had on Spanish society would have been devastating. And it's not only because it would offend pious ears, but also because it would influence the weak and the impressionable and the naive, to say nothing of the grave offense that it would be against Almighty God, right? So what happened? In Spain, as in other Catholic nations, just as Archbishop Minerath approvingly noted, all mention of Catholicism as the state religion and any privileges afforded to the church disappeared from concordats and such Bill of Rights and so forth that were drafted after 1964. Those things disappeared. And about this situation, Bishop Mark Pivaronis of the CMRI, he wrote this, quote, "What was the outcome of this change in the Concordat? From the date of the change, any religious sect was free to proselytize in Catholic Spain. And what followed? With the circulation of all manner of opinions and beliefs, Spain eventually legalized pornography, contraceptives, divorce, sodomy, and abortion. And this example is by no means just limited to Spain," end quote. So, I mean, this is the kind of thing that we see happening, throughout the world. And, often people will talk about, the sexual revolution in the 60s and, the big hippie thing that happened here in the United States. And as if it's a coincidence, the Vatican II happened at the same time, but it's the withdrawal of the voice of the one true Church of Christ, insisting upon the rights and prerogatives of Christ the King and the church that he established. That's what opened the door to all of this nonsense. No wonder the world's going to hell in a handbasket, because the voice of Holy Mother Church is essentially missing when it comes to asserting the rights of Christ.
I talked to an elderly man who lived, he was an adult in the 1960s, and he said that at the time they really thought the world was ending. Like, they really thought, like, this cannot, it was so abnormal what was happening. JFK, Martin Luther King Jr., getting shot and killed, and you had the sexual revolution, you had Vietnam, you had Vatican II, and they really thought we are going to see the end of the world. And I think I think we look back at it now too, and it's hard to imagine having been through those times. How do you live through that when you actually saw the destruction of the church as people knew it? Obviously the church cannot be destroyed, but I mean, as the structures in Rome were taken over within 5 years. That's just always something that always shocks me. It's like it was a solid foundation under a good pope, and then it wasn't. Just like that, just within a decade, and just to have lived through that is something hard to even fathom.
Yeah, I've thought about that before, and I'm grateful for the fact that, I was born in 1961, so I was able to get baptized in the old rite, thank God. But I wasn't like, if I had been in my 20s or 30s when the council unfolded, it would be like, oh my gosh, you have to feel sorry for those people. The carpet was ripped out from under them violently. I never knew what we lost until I came to be educated about it, but it must have been so difficult for those people. And no small number of them, I have a close friend whose grandparents were deeply Catholic. They walked away. They said, obviously, this isn't real. It's not true. The church is gone. They were totally devastated. And others established, a movement to try to recover and to hold on to tradition. But for some people, it was just overwhelming to the point where they just walked away. They kept their faith to themselves. They prayed the rosary at home, and that was it, In any case, so I want to wrap our examination of Dignitatis Humanae up by asking two very important questions. And one is this: is the Council's teaching on religious liberty meant to be infallible? And secondly, is it binding? Now, for those who believe that Vatican II is Catholic, and so too is the church that propagates the Council's teachings, and the men who have been leading it for 60 plus years, if they believe that these men are true popes, for those persons, if we answer the first question regarding infallibility in the affirmative, well, then we have to come to the same conclusion with respect to the second question. In other words, if Dignitatis Humanae is being presented as an infallible teaching by the Council, well, of course it's binding, right? Well, the good news is that the answer to both of these questions is very clearly given in two places in the text, Article 2 and Article 9. Article 2 says this: the Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed word of God and by reason itself. End quote. Now, the architects of the Declaration obviously thought that this point was so critically important that they were moved to repeat it, almost verbatim, in Article 9, which states this: the declaration of this Vatican Council on the right of man to religious freedom has its foundation in the dignity of the person, whose exigencies have come to be fully known to human reason through the centuries of experience. What is more, this doctrine of freedom has roots in divine revelation, and for this reason, Christians are bound to respect it all the more conscientiously. End quote. So, is this an infallible teaching based on the way the Council is presenting it to us? Well, in order to answer this, we really need to take a closer look at the extent of infallibility. What is infallible when it comes to church teaching? Is it just ex cathedra proclamations? Is it just those things taught by the ecumenical councils where the converse is anathematized? Well, the answer is no. It actually goes beyond that. And to get into this a little bit more deeply, I want to consider what the eminent theologian, Father E. Sylvester Barry, wrote on the subject. And I like quoting Father Barry because our friends in the Resist the Pope movement, the Pelican people, they love to quote Father Barry. And for good reason. I mean, he was an eminent theologian. His works were approved by the church. The manuals that he wrote are extremely helpful in breaking open the teachings of the church to delve into the primary sources like the teachings of the councils, the encyclicals of the popes, and telling us what they truly mean. And in his 1927 work that was titled The Church of Christ, an apologetic and dogmatic treatise, Father Barry says this, quote, since the church is endowed with infallible authority for the express purpose of preserving intact the deposit of revealed truth and for expounding it without error, she must also be infallible in judging of doctrines and facts so intimately bound up with revealed truths that they cannot be denied or questioned without endangering revealed truth itself. Such doctrines and fact constitute the secondary object or extent of infallibility. Okay, so those teachings that are so bound with revealed truth, they must be infallible. Otherwise, it undermines the church's ability to preserve and to expound upon revelation without error. Father Barry went on to say this, quote, this secondary or indirect extent of infallibility includes especially theological conclusions. Now, theological conclusions it's one designation of certain teachings that fall into this category. And we're going to focus on it for a reason that's going to become very obvious in a minute. Father Barry went on to explain in greater detail exactly what constitutes a theological conclusion, which in itself is a object of infallibility. He writes this, quote, "A theological conclusion is a proposition logically deduced from two premises, one of which is a revealed truth, the other a truth known by reason." End quote. So what are the necessary ingredients here, okay, for a secondary object of infallibility? The doctrine being taught, although not revealed, is, quote, intimately bound up with revealed truths. Specifically with regard to theological conclusions, Father Barry tells us that they are, quote, deduced from two premises, one which is a revealed truth, the other a truth known by reason. They're deduced in that manner. But what did the council say about religious freedom? Well, as we just read from Articles 2 and 9, the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the dignity of the person, which is known to human reason, and what's more, this doctrine of freedom has roots in divine revelation. These are the ingredients for putting forth a theological conclusion, which is a secondary object of infallibility. It's an infallible teaching. So the council is, and I would argue it's very deliberate, even if this point was lost on the more tradition-minded bishops, which we have noted throughout this series, they dropped the ball in Vatican Council II. Even if this thought escaped them, it's pretty clear to me that the council is deliberately presenting its teaching on religious liberty as a secondary object of infallibility. Article 9, in just 2 sentences, states precisely the two premises that make it so, right? So, Kevin, at this, I think, we don't really need to consider any further whether or not the teaching presented by Vatican II is binding. I mean, look, if it's infallible, well, then of course it's binding. But even so, the council went to the trouble of making the obligation on believers towards this teaching on religious freedom explicit. It states in Article 9, Christians are bound to respect it all the more conscientiously. Now, that word bound might jump out at viewers. Bound and binding, it's the same concept. If they're bound, that means they've been binded, okay? Now, I have to say, though, in an effort to be entirely accurate, the word bound, even though it's found in the official English translation on the Unholy See website, the Latin text does not include the equivalent, which would be the word obligantur, which is the word from which we get the English word obligate. Okay, but what it does say is Christianis sancte servanda est, which is best translated as saying that this teaching must be sacredly observed or held sacred by Christians. Now, we could quibble, I suppose, about whether or not this amounts to the council explicitly binding the faithful to this teaching. But what's beyond any doubt at all is that the council was very clear and deliberate in presenting its doctrine of religious freedom as an object of infallibility. As Father Barry stated, the church must be infallible in judging such doctrines. And the council used a specific formula for putting this teaching out to make it clear. It's deduced from two things, human reason and divine revelation. And those are the ingredients for a secondary object of infallibility, known as a theological conclusion. So I think in conclusion, I would have to say that in spite of the many ways in which Dignitatis Humanae deviates from the faith, as plainly taught in the centuries leading up to Vatican II, if any of our viewers really believe that this text comes to us from the Catholic Church, then they have to maintain that it's both infallible and binding. And it seems to me that those who have even just a modicum of Catholic sense or the sincerity to develop a Catholic sense, it should be entirely obvious that this text most certainly is not infallible, nor could it have possibly come from a valid ecumenical council of the one true Church of Christ.
Well, I appreciate it because as we mentioned before, that is really an argument you hear often from the R&R people, it's really bad. They'll do their own podcasts. That was a really bad council, so much evil. But doesn't really matter. That's almost what they end up like. That's a conclusion, right? It's kind of like, yeah, but yeah, it's not binding, right? It was just a council that was just kind of for fun, I guess. I don't know. It was just kind of, they just did it just because it's not actually binding. And I've always felt that was a very cheap argument, because that doesn't, I mean, why would they have a council if it's not a serious matter? It's something that binds the faithful. And I'm glad you brought this up. That makes a lot more, not sense, I guess, but it kind of brings it together. It really says, okay, yeah, you can't just throw this away. You can't just be like, yeah, it's bad, but no, is it Catholic or not? And I think again, come on, guys, look at the fruits. Look what we have right now in 2025. Whenever you're watching this video, I guarantee you're going to have the same thing. If you're watching this in 2030, we're almost guaranteed you're going to be saying, yeah, well, the Pope right now did this, and this. Maybe he's going to make women deacons, or going to go hold hands with Hindus. It's going to happen. Louie and I know it, because you know why? Because it's been happening for 60 years. So again, because it stems from this council. So it's like, I mean, unless by some grace of God, it all changes, which it could happen. Obviously, God can do anything. And so maybe we will somehow get a true Pope. I hope and pray that happens, but it's not likely. So whenever you're watching this, you're probably thinking, oh man, the Pope did it again. Well, look, guys, here you go. It all stems back to here. And that is, again, why we come to the conclusion that there is no Pope right now on the seat of St. Peter. Louie, as always, I greatly appreciate you. Thank you so much for the work you put into this, the time and the effort. It really is some of the best stuff that we have on this channel for sure, and some of the best stuff on the internet. I really believe it. I hope people watch it. I hope they see the truth to it, and I hope they go over and check out your other content at akacatholic.com. If you're watching, or if you finished watching this all the way through, thank you. Please like, share, subscribe, leave a comment to let us know what you think of the series. We have a couple more videos coming up, but we're coming to the end of the series, and I'm not going to lie, I'm going to miss it a little bit. I'm going to miss Louie. I'm going to have to find something else for him to talk about, because it's been a lot of fun, and again, Louie, we appreciate you, and I guess again we'll see you for the next few episodes here to wrap up this series, and until then, God bless you, and God bless all of our viewers.
Thank you, Kevin. Looking forward to it.